I mean, I was there. I was there to do. I did the workshop the day before on the Friday, and then I was I was put on the spot to present on portals. But it was a lot of fun. I mean, getting to meet you and meet a lot of other folks face to face and hang out. It was a highlight of the year for me. I mean, uh, a lot of things changed for me after that particular event. So really, really delighted to have you here with us presenting today. If you don't know yet, I want you to know, and I'm recording that I have the utmost respect for what you do, but besides that, for you as a person. So really appreciate you taking the time to teach us today. So I don't want to take any more of your time because I know you have a lot of good information to present. So
No, no, I
it's all
appreciate it.
yours.
Yeah, no problem. I appreciate it, and now I'm embarrassed, but thank you. And again, it's kind of nice. We have a smaller crowd. We've got about what 45 minutes for this, and got a lot to go through. Let me share real quick. But feel free, and again, just my disclaimer. I was saying earlier that there might be some hammering and stuff outside. Have some people doing some construction outside, so pardon me for that. And of course, the standard disclaimer for pets. Our dog doesn't like the noise either. So yeah, let's just get into it. And again, feel free to cut in at any time. Make sure I can see the team. I don't know if can you see my screen? Cool. Yeah. I'll keep an eye on the questions, but feel free to pop in. We've got a small crowd, so this is always nice to have as much of a conversation as me just speaking at you. So feel free to cut in. I got a couple of slides. We'll dive into some code. If you want to look at anything in detail, you got any feedback? I mean, Victor, you obviously got a ton of work on Portal, so feel free to chime in with anything. This is obviously not super comprehensive, but it's just based on some experiences I've had. So I'm always open to feedback, better ways of doing things, or hey, I've got a cool story with implementing something here. So yeah, let me go through the slides. If I can use a mouse correctly, I'll try to do that. That's me. This is just a little bit of information on how to contact me. I've been MVP for 2 years, so I've been pretty excited about that. Ridiculous community of smart, insanely smart people, and just a great way to learn from the community. So real quick, I'm going to talk a little bit fast because we're about 45 minutes, and I think I scoped this out for about an hour when I originally did it. So I'll get through as much as we can. But again, I'd like this to be a conversation with everybody as much as just go through slides. So I'd like to cover the Liquid template language recap. I'm going to skip that because I'm going to assume some of us are all familiar with Liquid. If not, I have another video that I can share with you on that and slide deck to go along with it. That would just kind of hear the moving parts with the Liquid language. But let's dive right into some of the more advanced stuff from my perspective. Is working with data collections. Pretty powerful tools in the Liquid language for dealing with data. And that's a lot of the reason you're dealing with Liquid to start with. I've got data that I want to put on the portal that I can't do with configuration. So there's some really nice features in the language for that. Another big one, which is very common, is using fetch XML. And they just updated the documentation on this. For a long time, it wasn't super well documented. And it's specific to Dynamics and CDS and Dataverse, whatever we're calling it this week. It's specific to the Power Platform, so you can't find it documented anywhere else, like in the Shopify documentation. And then we'll talk about using web templates and using Liquid to serve up data as essentially a web service, a REST endpoint. There's I have some examples there, and that was inspired by a few other blog posts from some other portal gurus that I follow, and I'm sure everybody's familiar with. And then looking at some of the template reuse, because like with any other language, we don't want to copy and paste our code. So let's look at how we can use it. What are some language structures we can use for doing template reuse, and one of them is includes. And then look a little bit at some of the mechanisms for extending templates. How do we have like base templates that we use in other places? And then kind of tying it all together using all these different things we're going to talk about for doing complex custom pages. And at that point, we'll just look at some examples I have with a portal that I've been working on for a while. So that was kind of fast. Again, feel free to jump in. That's my standard disclaimer. Don't be shy. First thing, language basics. Like I said, we'll skip that and we'll assume you're familiar with it, but we can share the slides here. This just goes over some of the objects, tags, and filters that are common to the language, and then where to use them. Again, assume everybody's familiar with this. So I'll just skip through these very quickly. And there's my one animation. I highlighted web templates. So that was my complex PowerPoint skills in action right there. So data collections. So again, as I mentioned, a lot of times when you jump into Liquid, the reason you're doing it is I need to display some data in my system, Power Platform, CDS Dataverse, or Dynamics that I can't do with just configuration only. An entity list doesn't cut it. So I want to deal with data, and I want to format it my own way. I want to iterate it and filter on it and display it in my own way. Well, with two mechanisms for that, and one is called array and one's called dictionary. Those are two important types of data elements in the language, and they're very similar. And the only real distinction between them is an array is just a numerical index of items, and you can just loop through them. A dictionary, you can actually access items by ID. With an array, you can access by position, like give me item 7. But a dictionary, I can have a unique identifier for an item and grab it that way. Key value pairs, if you're familiar with programming languages. Those are two really powerful tools for iterating on data. And you can see on the right-hand side, we've got some real simple examples right out of the documentation. In fact, I think I literally copied and pasted this. An array is you can iterate over an array of items. In this case, we've got an entity list that has a list of views, an array of views. And this Liquid right here is just spinning over the items and putting them out onto the page. And then the last line is just accessing the 0 element. It's indexed at 0, not 1. So give me the first item in the list by position. And then a dictionary, we literally use a variable called ID to access a parameter from the request params dictionary, and you get it by ID, and then you can check for the param size, and that's a common attribute on these list items. But whether it's array or dictionary, I can access the size and decide whether I want to do something. So there's a lot of information, not just the data contained within the arrays or dictionaries, but about the arrays or dictionaries. And that's an example right there, is the property of size. Whenever you're iterating on them, because typically you don't just get a collection and hang on to it, you want to iterate over the items like we're seeing in that first example with the for loop. You can also access these properties like size. And another object that you get with your arrays and your collections is a for loop. And that tells you where you are when you're iterating over these items. You might want to, if you're putting a delimited list together, end with a delimiter only if it's not the last item in the list. So you don't have a trailing comma, for example. So those are some really nice features, and there's a lot more to it. That's just one example that comes with their properties and objects associated with your list whenever you're iterating on items that are very helpful whenever you're coding. And we'll look at some examples in this in a few. And another structure that I didn't discover until a little bit after doing brute force method for iterating on items is batch and group by. And we'll look at an example there because that's pretty important. It allows me to take an array or a dictionary and group them together and batch them together by size. And I'll show you an example where we do a list of cards, and I want to decide how many items on a row for the cards. And I'll show you an example of that. Those are really, really helpful when you got some more complex iterations on arrays, a more complex layout, whether it's putting it on screen or grouping items together. So that's data collections. We'll look at some examples in the next couple. We'll look at the next slide first, and then we'll dive into some code, and we'll look at some examples of how these are used. Any questions so far? I'm looking all over the place. I see myself all over the place, so hopefully I don't look silly.
Nope.
Cool. Okay, cool. Thank you. So we have the next on the list is fetch XML. And if you're familiar with Dynamics over the years, which is now turned into CDS, which is now Dataverse, working with Power Platform, fetch XML is a really powerful query language, a query tool that we can put into our Liquid templates and grab data from the system. Just like whenever you're putting it into your code within a plugin or in JavaScript, fetch XML can be used in Liquid, and you can just grab data right out of the system. So you can use them within your page templates, web forms, entity forms, etc. And that allows us basically to do a query on the data that you might not be able to do in a view. Like an entity list, for example, you might have some issues with parameterizing for the current user in the system. So you might want to do some more complex parameters for dates and times. So put a fetch XML query together, and you can render this information on the page. And you can parameterize it. So you can take the variables that we've looked at before, a parameter from your let's say your query string, and use it. And we'll look at an example of this to filter your fetch XML. So you can parameterize it just like you would do normally in code. And the link entities and aliases are supported. So that's really nice, where you can go and do some complex queries, bring back an aggregate of your data, and you can access this information just as you would in normal code. It's really, really nice because you can go back and do complex queries that you might not be able to do in a standard view. And it's really nice tool that add to the fetch capabilities. And what it returns is it returns an array or a dictionary. In fact, it's a combination. Let me read it to make sure I get it right. You return an object that contains a list of entity records. So I believe that's an array, and then each has a dictionary of attribute values. Very similar to your standard JavaScript or C# coding, but you can access this in your Liquid templates as well. And the last bit that I'll mention about fetch, the cool thing is the entity permissions are applied. So when you query this, you're not doing a backdoor into the system and bypassing security. The same security is applied as if it was an entity list, entity view, or pages. All the other permissions are applied. Your entity permissions are applied as if you're coming in through your configurable portal elements. So you're not sneaking in. It's not a security issue, and it's also one of those things I always mention because I start putting fetch XML into my Liquid, and the first thing I forgot or I look at, I'm not getting any data back. Well, I forgot to add any permissions to the data I'm retrieving, so I have to go back and put the permissions on. So it's really nice. It's secure. It locks things down unless you open up permissions, just like anywhere else in the portal. So again, it's not a backdoor. You're not sneaking in. It's a secure way of accessing data in your portal. So let me jump into an example real quick, and I think I shared the slide. I'm going to have to change and share my screen. Once again, hopefully nothing embarrassing is up on my screen. Let me do screen 1 and bring up some code. So what I have is, can everybody read this okay? I'm not sure what the resolution looks like. Should I zoom in at all?
Yeah, maybe zoom in a little bit if you could, Jim.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I forget how to zoom in zoom control plus. Right, there we go. Control equals. I can never remember the command. There we go. Is that better? Cool.
Yeah.
I always do the scroll wheel and it doesn't work on Visual Studio Code. So what I'm looking at here is there's a tool in the XRM toolbox. If you're not familiar with it, it's insanely powerful. Written by Tanguy, who did the entire XRM toolbox, and it's called Portal Code Editor, or Portal Script Editor. One of the two. I'm sure I need to get that correct. And it allows you to export. So you can dump this out the disk, and that's what I've done. So I've dumped out my entire list of script, CSS, web templates, the pages, the whole 9 yards, and I'm able to look at it on disk. So that's what we're looking at here. So what I have is I just have what is a web template that I named. It's a fetch. Basically does nothing more than execute some fetch statements for me. And the syntax is pretty straightforward. Again, fortunately, they've updated the documentation and it works, looks really nice. They're doing a good job on that. So it's a little frustrating for a while. But basically the statement is fetch, and you pass in the name of the variable you want the executed fetch to populate. And in my situation, I've got a portal, which we'll pop over to in a moment. That's where most of the examples come from. We've got a portal for events, and this is a fetch basically to grab all of the information about a session. So I've got a portal for events, and in the event, kind of like we're doing now, I've got a session, it's got a title, and it's got a presenter, and it's got some other information about its start and end time, and I've got some other parameters there, or sorry, attributes there. And I want to gather all the information up, and I have one web template that populates a couple of variables using multiple fetch statements. And the syntax, again, is very straightforward. It's, execute the fetch inside my tag and populate this variable called session. And in here, what I wanted to point out, and I mentioned earlier, is I've got this variable that I'm parameterizing. This is standard stuff. If you're familiar with fetch, this should look very, very familiar. I'm taking the ID from the query string. So the request has a parameters collection, and this is what we looked at before in the example from our previous slides. I'm going to grab the ID from the parameter and the URL, and I get that by accessing it by key, I guess it would be a key and a key value pair as opposed to an index. And now I can use that in my fetch XML, and I use it throughout the rest of them. So I'm just going to grab all the session information, and you can see this is my my custom entity and my subscriber or no, a publisher. Sorry, not subscriber. My publisher prefix is PowerApps, and these are my custom attributes for my custom entity. I'm just going to grab them, and I'm going to do a filter by ID. So I'm going to get the information about the individual session here. Then I'm going to grab the individual speakers related to the session, just doing a join like I would normally. So the link entity, as I mentioned, works really well. And down here, I'm grab another list of, I have what I call them tags, and it's just a very simple way of tagging a session. And I'm going to grab all this information into a series of variables that I can then access later. So that's cool. I can run fetch XML, execute it, and spit it back into some values of dictionaries and arrays and combinations of objects that I can work on in another template. And where do I have that? I have that over session details page. So if I wanted to render this on a page, here's where I use the result of that fetch. And I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself because I mentioned includes, and here's an example of it. And we'll look at what that means in a moment. But basically, it allows me to execute this fetch, and I'm going to populate those variables, and then I can work on them here. And you can see that I can assign these sessions to a variable called session. I'm going to get the first one in the list because I'm assuming that my query ran correctly, and I'm going to add this is an array of entities, and I'm getting it by position, as we talked about, as opposed to a dictionary, which is by ID. And I've give me the first one. There should be one and only one, and obviously no error handling here because of course it's going to work correctly. I've got no issues in this. And then here's what I can do with the tag groups, and I mentioned the group by. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to take the tags from that other variable that I populated, and the syntax or the convention is it populates the variable, creates an object called results on there, a property called results, and in that is the collection of entities that is returned. And what I want to do is I have another tag called group by, which will take that and in the tag groups, group all the items as if you're doing a query and you're doing a group by in a SQL statement or what other query language you're using. And I got a comment just because I try to comment my work. So I remember what I did last time I looked at this, and now I'm rendering it. I'm using that information that I grabbed in those previous fetch statements, and I'm populating some HTML that go into a screen. So it's pretty cool. I went through my fetch statement just to review. We did. I got a variable called session, another one called speakers, another one called tags, and another one called links. Should probably get rid of the top 50 there. I doubt there's going to be more than 50 links. That'd be a pretty hefty session. And I'm using the variable ID that we got out of my dictionary of parameters. So we're using all that, and they're all related to this one session, and I'm able to access them here whenever I have this other page. And what they include, again, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, is imagine that I pasted in this fetch template at the top of the page, and that's essentially what it means. So now I'm going to render this, and I can go through and I'm iterating on the group of tag groups, and then I have basically a child object called group.items. And you can see I'm iterating and I'm rendering all the tag groups, and I'm putting them into a span with some, bootstrap styles. And I have up here the header area, and I'm grabbing the variable, the PowerApp, the name attribute and the subtitle attribute of the session. And basically I'm building a screen with all that information. You can see I'm doing the description is a blob of HTML. So I'm going to first escape it, convert my new lines to breaks. These are some custom tags in Liquid, which is really, really helpful. And then I'm going to strip out the new line so that it looks nice. And I just want compact HTML. So this is again, if you've worked with Liquid templates before, I'm rendering some HTML using objects, but the data came from using fetch XML. And let me jump over and just see what that looks like. Again, I'm looking all over the place. I promise I practiced this, I swear. So here's the portal that I mentioned, and this has been around for a little bit. It's an event portal. This is a static page, and it's just got a list of this is how we manage the events. And I'm just going to pull up one of the events, and we'll look at where that HTML is rendered. And this is actually a custom page, and this is all done through Liquid as well. So this is just another example of some cool things you can do with Liquid in terms of rendering. I tried to do it with event, entity lists, and it was just painful. I wanted this custom format. I just couldn't really do it with the out-of-the-box stuff, so I put together some Liquid templates. Let me pull up Tampa, and this is another page that shows all the information about one event. Can you all see this okay too?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, cool. Nobody's screaming at me, so I'm assuming it's okay for the time being. But this is another completely custom page all done with Liquid. There's even Liquid in the CSS that I have up here to render and put the background image in. Totally stole that from a blog post from somebody. It worked out really well. So there's a custom image, that's Tampa. And I render the top area here, and then here's the sessions we talked about. But what I was doing was I wanted individual details about one session, and where do I use that page? Well, I use it in this pop-up. So this page, what we're looking at right here, is what we spit out. And let me bounce back to that. That's what this Liquid template renders. So we'll go into that in a few, and I'll show you where this is rendered, but this is a page that I put together that does a query about one session, brings back all the information using a couple of fetch statements, puts all the data into these variables, and then I can spit it out in whatever format I like. So this is an example of what this page spits out, and it's a good one because it's got multiple speakers, it's got multiple, here's the tags we talked about, there's the parent tag, which is I think I forget what I called it, a group or a category, but then these are the child tags. Here's the session abstract. You can see that this was pulling in the line feeds and carriage returns from those filters. And then here's a list of links, and it gives me the ability to put all this information into one screen. So it was pretty nice that imagine doing this in a out of the box configured web form, for example. It would have been really, really, really clunky and ugly. So that's one example of Fetch XML, and that's a really nice, powerful method for gathering a bunch of data using custom queries and then spitting it out however I like. So cool. Let me go back to the slides real quick. And again, any questions, feel free to jump in whenever you like. And where are we on time? What do we have? Okay, cool. We got time. So web templates as a service. Imagine if I didn't want to spit out all that HTML and I just wanted to spit out data, whether it's XML or JSON or whatever format we like. This is a really powerful one. And this was, I got for this from a blog post, which I had the link for at the end of the slides, from Colin Vermander. And it basically allows me to use a portal to serve up REST data. So I can post a REST service, and then it's relatively easy to do. Basically, because so everybody correct me if I'm wrong on this. I don't think the REST data endpoints or the web API for portals doesn't include just gathering data yet, does it? They tell you to use Liquid, if I remember right.
I think it's only create, update, and delete.
Cool. Okay, so that's all right. So this is still valid. Okay, good.
Yeah, it is. It's still valid.
Yeah, I thought it was supposed to be on the radar at some point, but they said, hey, we've got Liquid, just do that. So this is a really nice way of serving up REST data if you want to, and it's basically you turn a web template into a REST endpoint, and it's a very simple steps. It's basically you create a new web template and a page template, and on your web template you set the MIME type, which in our example is either JSON or XML. In the example I'll show you it's JSON, and then you create a new page with that page/web template, and you disable the header and footer, and that's really the kicker. The header and the footer would inject all kinds of stuff that the portal expects, scripts and rendering of all this stuff. And if you turn those off, and I'll show you the page here in a moment, it just spits out raw whatever you want it to spit out. It's a really easy way of just spitting out raw information. You use it for anything, but the header and the footer is the key for this. The MIME type and the header and the footer. And then basically you just load the URL like you would any other REST endpoint using HTTP or AJAX request. So I'll show you it in action. Let me jump over to the portal and jump over to the web template. And the one I'm going to show you, in fact, I'll show you the template here real quick. The session details that I had for all that fetch, I can reuse in a different way, and I'm getting ahead of myself. I should put the include stuff at the top. So I had that fetch, and the reason I put it into its own page or web template is I want to reuse it multiple times. So I'm using the same call. Instead of rendering the page like we're doing here as HTML, I can use it to render JSON. So this is what it would look like. I'm going to use the same fetch, same data, and I just want to spit it out in a different way. And in this case, I go iterate on the groups, the same filtering and whatnot. And instead of HTML, I'm spitting out JSON. And I made up the structure. This is whatever you want it to be. This is just the simplest way for me to go put it into a page. What I was doing with this is instead of that modal rendering the HTML, I can just use JavaScript to build it if I like. Or I can say somebody wants to see all the sessions for an event. Here, go to this URL and grab the sessions. And I can have this reused multiple times. I can have it for an entire event. I can have it per session. In this case, it's one per session. So the syntax, you can see it just in the same exact kind of logic. In fact, I copied and pasted and removed HTML and wrapped it in JSON. And here are some of the things I talked about in the looping while we're looking at it. I'm iterating on the tag groups. And here is the statement right here. I talked about some really nice language features for loops or for looping. And with your for loop, I'm within a for loop tag. I've got this for loop object, and it tells me whether I'm at the last element or the first element. I think it gives you index, zero-based index, a couple of options on this. But what this allows me to do is, and then this is the example I mentioned, in JSON, I don't want to have a trailing comma because it's invalid JSON. This way I check when I'm iterating on it. If I'm at the last one, don't put in the comma, I'm done. Really neat. And those are the little things that bite you. And whenever you first start putting this stuff out, you get invalid JSON. And I use it, you can see that the same structure in a couple of places highlighted. So it's a really neat feature that comes with the language. And it makes your life a little bit easier when you're rendering this kind of stuff. So what would that look like? Basically, what I would do is I'll go back over to the portal and I want to look at, let me just start with a page actually. And because I have them filtered a little bit better. And I have, where is my event session? Actually, let me look at the event calendar JSON because that's another one that I use as well. And we'll look at that in detail. This is one where I have a calendar on the portal. And basically, here's what I was talking about. I have a standard web page and I can go into the localized content, but I've got a page template that has a specific, and here's where I basically disable the use website header and footer. So this tag is unticked. And you just basically bind it to a page, and our web template spits out JSON. This is just another example of, instead of it being the session we looked at, I'm going to spit out entire event lists that I can use in a calendar. So this is the structure for it. You can see it's application JSON as the MIME type. That's the other bit. So if I start from the web template, I create the web template with the application JSON as the MIME type, and I go back up to my page, a corresponding page template, and I turn that off, or I'm sorry, this tick box right here, I turn that off, and then I bind it to a page. And if I want to access that, I basically go back to my page, backwards, I don't want to go forward again, and I go to this page. I can go to that page with an ID and grab the JSON. And the example that I was looking at before with the session, I saved off a link to it because I was lazy. But the page that we were looking at here, I showed you the template. So the PowerApp template, this information on this page here's a JSON representation of it. And I can do whatever I want with it. It's got the encoded information in here, which is kind of nice. So that should be okay for passing over the wire. And again, the first version of this page, I actually did render it with JavaScript, and it just got clunky. So I just put it into a page and I spit it into the frame. But I can do whatever I want with this, and all you can see here is I'm just accessing it from a URL. And the URL is my page with the parameter of ID for the session, and it goes out, and first thing it'll do is call my fetch queries, and then it'll render it as JSON and spit back the raw JSON because I turned off the header and footer. So cool, we've got a REST endpoint. If anybody here wants information about a session, you can grab this and I'll give you an ID for it, and you can render it however you like. Put it on a calendar, render it in another page, do magic with it, I'm not sure. So does that make sense? You can basically turn your portal into a series of REST endpoints and serve up all the data if you like. It's pretty cool. So let me go back to, that's a really nice one because you might have some really, really complex stuff. And in fact, the calendar is a good example. I forgot to show you the calendar. Let me pop over to that. So I have the calendar over here, event calendar, very simple page. This page is very, very simple. It's got nothing more than a calendar control, another Colin Vermander blog post if you want to look up his stuff. And the data behind it comes from that service that we talked about. This is a third-party calendar control. You can see it's a little bit old because nobody's going to events for a while. But these are all the events that were scheduled over last year, and I'm able to bind that data to a JSON element that's served up by the page we looked at. So it's kind of neat. And it goes right over to the page. Here's the page itself, and this is a different version of the page detail we were looking at earlier. So cool. So let me go next. So template reuse with includes. Here we are, finding the two includes. We've seen it a couple of times. What does it mean? You probably already know. You've probably already used it. But what it allows me to do is avoid copying and pasting code. So I can have a web template that I can reuse in multiple different places. So in effect, I can have a reusable snippet of code that I call from multiple places. And we saw that with the fetch web template that we had. I just pass in a parameter, and there's a convention there. The first line of that fetch template that we looked at had an assumption that I'm going to have a URL with the ID in it. So that's an assumption, but I'm able to use that in two different places right off the bat and not have to change one line of code. If I change it in one place, I change it in multiple. So this is, again, just like calling a function in code. And in fact, you can do, and again, the reasons for this are right there in the slide. Reduce errors. I put everything in one place. If I change it in one place, I change it everywhere. Could blow things up if you're not using it properly, but that's up to your dev team or you to keep track of. But allows me to have reuse of these templates and reuse and narrow things down and reduce my footprint of code. And scope is important and convention is important. So whenever you call these reuse, and I created, if you remember, I created those templates and I created a variable called session, tags, I believe, and links. Those variables were defined in the page template that I called, but I can access them outside of the include statement. So once I rendered them, I populated these variables that I knew would be there. So by convention, I knew they could be there, but I could also overwrite them by mistake. So when you do the include and you have variables that are populated within and used without, you have to be aware of that. You just have to be aware of the risk of overwriting your data. And it really depends on the scope of what you're doing. In my example, I wanted that to be session and tags because I'm using them specifically in 2 different places. So I know because I wrote it and I'm working on it. But I could easily overwrite that it's like JavaScript whenever they put in namespaces to complete, keep us from overwriting our variables, which are all global by default in JavaScript. But the nice thing about it is you can actually treat it like a function. You can put in parameters that are named parameters that are passed in to your template that allow you to pass in as if you're in a function in C# or JavaScript. I can pass in parameters to my function. And in this example over here, we see this show descriptions is true. That's a parameter that's passed in, and I can do some conditional logic. And this is an out-of-the-box one. The include statement, this is right from another template for, I think, base page templates. And it allows me to do conditional logic based on how it's being requested for use. And that's something you can do if you want to keep yourself from overwriting things. You can pass in parameters for different types of usage, and you can use them as if they're functions. And in fact, I want to show you an example of one that I had an issue with sorting on dates and time, and I'll show you real quick a neat thing that I put together that was kind of helpful. And I used another blog post that I found that I can't remember what it was. I like to give him credit, but I can't find the post. And I have a web template that allows me to basically sort dates and times. And I'm trying to find it. Date as integer is what it's called. There we go. So what this template is doing is I had this issue where I wanted to compare dates. And in Liquid, I had trouble doing that with just comparing the date objects. Like, is this date greater than, is it greater than today or not? So I found an example of doing date comparisons, and they basically convert it to a number. And they take a date, they format it as a number using effectively the ISO date, I believe, and they convert it to a number that is comparable. You can do a greater than or less than and a number. So they basically converted a date to a number, and they account for the keep them as 2-digit dates, 2-digit values in each of these different masks. So that's all this is really doing. But it basically takes a date, converts it into an integer. And this is where I was talking about the date can convert as a parameter that's passed in. So I assign it. So this date convert is where it's being used, and I'll pull that up in a moment. That allows me to pass it in and protect myself from overwriting it. And I call it this date. And then I parse those out into month and year, looking at the date parts, using the different masks in the date tag, the date filter. And then I just build an integer, which is a standard format. And my output, right? The problem with templates is you have to populate a variable that the caller is aware of. And that's where this is a date as int is the output of my function. Again, I'm doing air quotes and you can hopefully all see me. So I'm calling this, I want to convert the date of date to convert into an int, and I would output as date as int. And where's that used? Where that is used is event details. I believe it's used here. I zoomed in. So let me see as int. So here is one where I'm calling it. So here's how I use it. And I have a function. Again, I'm having a Liquid template as a function, and this one is very handy because you can do this with a lot of different things. And what I do is I first say now. What I want to do is hide and show links if the date is past now or past today or in the future. So I first say, convert now to a date as int, and I have that as now date. And then where I use it is the next place I use it is a variable coming in from the PowerApp date registration date, right? So if the registration date is past due, don't show them the registration link. And then I throw that into a variable because here's the output of it. So this is where I'm going to overwrite the previous call to it. Here's a call for speaker date. So every time I call this, date is in is getting overwritten, but I know that, and I'm capturing it immediately after I call it. So I can use it as a function, but I have to be very aware of the convention that I'm using whenever I do it. But then what I can do is where I use this is it allows me now to compare if the date of or registration date is past due, then don't show the link. Show the registration is ended. So there's a really simple example of a really neat way of using includes to treat them as a function as opposed to just clumping together different kind of Lego block construction of pages. You can also use them to pass in some and do some very specific logic for you. So it's kind of a neat feature that I kind of found I stumbled upon after digging through some issues with this. With the dates and stuff. I think it's where I really started using them as functions. Does that make sense on how to use them? Anybody have any questions about that?
We have one hand up, but I think we can probably save it for the end of the session.
Sounds good.
It's for me. I mean, if you are having a hard time following the content so far, if you could post, if anybody is having a hard time, and they can post it on the chat window, we'll try to aggregate the questions.
Sounds good.
Towards the end.
Yep. Yeah, no problem. And again, I'll share the slides and feel free to reach out afterwards and we can talk a little bit more if you like. That's totally cool. So there's includes, and we've seen it a couple of times. It's used very heavily throughout the baseline. Ever install a baseline portal, the baseline templates, you'll see these used all over the place. And extending templates is next. And again, I'm going a little bit fast because we're coming up on time, and I want to leave a little bit of time for questions. But block and extends is something you also see throughout your pages. It basically allows you to, and I always equate it to the old school ASP.NET way of doing master pages, where you basically have a baseline page and I override segments of it. So I'm going to have a baseline page and call it header and footer, for example. And in child pages, I'm going to leave the header and footer the same, which is very much what we do in portals. And I want to override the body part of it. And that's where block and extends come in. And you basically, in a web template, you say, I have a series of blocks that I'm going to define kind of breaking apart my page. And they're not really very meaningful unless you extend that web template. They'll just render everything in that base template if you call it directly. But what you do with another web template is I have my baseline with my blocks defined. And then I say, with this child template, I'm going to extend it. I'm going to override those blocks that I care about, leave the rest of them the same. So it's a really nice way. And again, it's used throughout the pages. You'll see them in the baseline pages. We can take a look at them in a moment. But it's a really nice way of saying, I've got a standard way of laying out things, and I only want to override sections of it. And a header and a footer is the most common example you've probably seen. Let's take a look at one real quick that I had an example of. The event details page, which is what we were looking at on the other portal. And I bounce over there real quick. The event details page. Here's one example for a non-PowerUp event, hosted event. And we were looking at Tampa. That is one that was hosted a PowerUp event team. You can see all the stuff in there, pretty extensive. Got all the speakers in there with cards, and we've got all the sponsors. We got the organizers, might be some familiar faces in there. So this page template is pretty complex, but this kind of stuff at the top, I wanted to remain the same. So what I did was I broke it apart into blocks, and not very creative, but I called them block title, block main. And what I do with a page template, and I'm trying to remember how I did this because it's been a little while and it just works for me, but I have the event details loader, and I load up the event details page whenever I hit that page, or I load up an event details community. And both of those derive from, we'll look at what they extend, go back and look at what we looked at the blocks, and they extend the layout one column, but I can also derive those. And this is the baseline one, which that's just going to render everything. So I've got all the main stuff, I've got all the tracks, I've got all the speakers, the whole 9 yards. But if I do event details community, this is going to do one more level of extends, right? So I'm going to extend the PowerUp event details, and only thing I'm going to do is override block main. I'm not really going to do very much there. So it's basically, and that's just for making it look nice, a little bit of brute force formatting there. Probably do that with styles a bit better, but notice the only thing I'm doing is overriding block main. And in my page here for Tampa, all of the stuff here in the bottom after sessions and all that is going to be wiped out. It's just going to put in a little message saying that it's a different event. And this is what it would look like. So please support our fellow community events. So it allowed me to keep all that logic in literally one place and only overwrite the pieces that I needed. So the look and feel is the same, the layout, the flow, the whole 9 yards is the same. Very, very simple example. And again, I suggest going in and looking at the baseline pages in the out-of-the-box portal and see a lot more use of it. But it was a really simple example to allow me to not have to rewrite everything and do all kinds of includes. It just allowed me to have a baseline template and only override the bits, because I could have done that and had multiple templates, pulled in the image, the details and whatnot. Instead, I just said, I'm going to override the one bit that I don't want to show, and it worked out pretty well. So that's block and extends. There's a bit more to that, so I suggest taking a look at that in a little more detail. Again, used throughout the baseline template, so it's Microsoft using this themselves in the baseline portals. So wrapping it all up, so all the things we talked about allow us to build these complex custom pages. You know, I can use bringing in, I have got all these tools for manipulating data, iterating over data, bringing data in from our backend database, whether it's Power Platform or Dynamics. We've got fetch XML to retrieve complex data with filtering and parameterizing it and bringing in joins of all kinds of different stuff. I can then use my includes to segment my portal into reusable blocks. And in fact, this portal had multiple iterations where I had enormous liquid templates and I started whittling it down as I saw reuse and move things over into includes. And in fact, I probably have some things I'm not using. And then the block and extends allows me to customize and preserve a layout while overriding bits that I care about. And then the web templates for services allow me to, even within my own page, just serve up data where needed, as we saw in the calendar. So all these different pieces, again, this is just kind of scratching the surface. There's a lot more to portals, as most everybody on the call knows. But these are some key elements that allow me to build the portal we talked about. And we go take a look at some of the more complex pages that I'm kind of proud of. They work out pretty well. If we go back and look at Tempa, these are, I'll show you, again, just walk through the page real quick to close things out. We open up Tampa, there's an image up here and there's a bit of CSS that I inject some liquid into to bring in the image that's associated with the page on the back end. All of this is driven by CDS data under the hood. Sorry, Dataverse data, I'll get that right someday. Got a custom Google map over here that I just plop into the page using the address. And I think I even store off the longitude and latitude. I render some custom links over here. I've got some short URLs and some sharing. This is all a custom template right in the middle of the page. And then I've got a series of collapsible areas here using the same session details we talked about before, just to render it in two different ways. So I've got two different templates that use the same data and render it by schedule versus by location, or sorry, by track versus location. And this is where I work on the fetch, and I've brought together all the individual sessions versus, or sorry, the sessions for the event versus the individual sessions. And then I'm able to open them up with a link with a custom page. I tab through, this is just custom JavaScript that I pulled in, and I, using Bootstrap and some of their tools, but it basically allows me to segment this apart and show the individual details. This is another series of templates that I called card templates that I found a really neat blog on how to do Bootstrap cards. So this is something that this is not something that I invented, but now this comes in from the speaker profile. And all this is done, again, through a series of web templates that allow me to render this, and the batching and all that I mentioned allows me to put the number of rows on here that I like, put in the speaker card images and all their social links all coming in from CDS. Really would not have been possible with out-of-the-box configuration. Then these are all rendered as accounts. These are just the sponsors rendered as just blobs of HTML coming in from the account records associated with the session, or sorry, the event. And then here's our speaker list. You can see she spoke at the event as well. Okay, again, I think we're right about on time. If we have questions, we can jump over to that. Sorry, hopefully I covered everything that everybody wanted to see. And if you have any questions, we can jump on those now.
Let's check what we got here. We don't have any hands up. We had one hand up from Majunaf, I think. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, thanks Victor, and thanks Novak on the detailed session on the liquid template and language and other stuff. My question on the Portal Web API. If you're working with Portal Web API, I was curious, like we are using JSON format, or we can go with REST API approach with Ajax integration. But if we are stuck at some cases or something that if you're working on the retrieving large amount of data. So we want to handle the exceptions. So how are we handling that exceptions? Are we using a CSRF tokens, or is there any other way of handling that?
With large sets of data, I haven't used it for the examples we've looked at here, but I believe Fetch will serve up your tokens, just like I have to check on that. It'll serve up tokens for next and previous. One example to look at is actually go out to the Liquid documentation and look at the, there's an example of how to build a custom grid. And I'm trying to remember what it's called. I'll find the link for it, but that actually has a really good example on how to do paging. Because basically what it'll do is there's a Liquid template example of how to render a grid like you see with the out of the box for an event. Oh shoot, I'm blanking on it right now. The entity view. Ah, man, there we go. So it allows you to take an entity view, and that might give you an idea for how to handle the paging. As far as the exceptions, I'm not really sure. It totally would depend on the exception and what it is. But if you're bringing the data back in JSON and you've got an exception in JavaScript, it's standard stuff. If it's a server-side exception, I really haven't worried about that too much, so I don't have a good answer for you on that. But for the paging, I can find a link for you. And in fact, it's on this working with Liquid templates. Look at some of the complex examples they have there, and there's a really good one that I use for a lot of the paging stuff.
And next question is like, since if you're working on the portal web API, how about the table permissions? Like usually we are performing the CRUD operation, so we have to be, if you set any delete functionality on that, so we can't give the permissions to the external users, right? So how we have to control on that particular place? What is the best approach?
That one I'll defer to Victor. You did a lot on the web API. I haven't worked with it too much on this side. Most of this was for rendering read-only data. Would it be just the standard entity permissions?
There is a setting, a set of settings to configure which tables, if you will, respecting the new naming convention, which tables you want to allow to be the end user to interact with through the web API. You can configure, you can set up those settings to allow all tables to be open, if you will, to interact with web API, or you could granularly set it up. I can give you more details there too, Manjunath. But it does respect the entity permissions. So what you configure will also be respected by the web API.
Yeah, I think thanks, Victor. I think I'll wait for your response on that. And I think thanks, Novak. I think it's really a wonderful session on this, and you explained it details or more, but covering all the topics in the limited time. It's kudos for you.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. We have next here Franco, if you want to unmute yourself and
Thanks, Jim. Awesome session. Just had a quick query. In your JSON web template, I noticed you used escape filter. Do you happen to know off the top of your head if that deals with double quotes? I had an issue with them.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure. I know that I ran into. I think that is why I used it, but it's been a while. It's a good question.
I believe it does.
Okay, cool. Because
Franco, sorry,
say that again.
I was gonna say I believe it does. I had to rewrite a component for timeline on portals, and I wanted to expose data. And myself, I don't know what's going on. Somebody maybe self. I hear a lot of echo.
All right, brilliant. I've previously been doing it with
Sorry, Franco, I think I lost you. Can you unmute yourself once again, please?
Oh, sorry, I was just saying, excellent tip. I'll definitely use that. I've previously been doing it a long-winded way with using replace to say find any quotes and put a slash before them. So escape's much more tidy.
I believe it does, because I'm reading a lot of content, HTML content, and I'm using to make it safe for presentation onto the screen.
Yeah, and I'm looking at the example that I showed, and here is the Cloudsmith has a single quote, and it looks like that was escaped, and then here's the new line to breaks, and that actually worked out just for HTML rendering. And then there's the standard quote escaping here, and I think those are either, I'm not sure whether that's single or double. I can see what that shows up like.
Cool, because like you said, creating the JSON web templates is super easy, isn't it? It's just when you're not experienced with JSON, a few things to fall foul of. Like I am, I was wondering why my strings kept breaking, and that was the reason. Looking out for double quotes.
Yeah, there's always the chance you're going to miss one or two. And here's the 20 years experience bit. I'm just looking at the JSON versus what we're rendering. He's one to try too.
Cool, yeah, absolutely. Thanks again.
All right, I think we have one more from Carolina.
Hey, yeah, first of all, just want to say thank you for this session. It's very great content. I have a question. So, James, you mentioned that you are using Bootstrap and CSS. So I'm pretty new on Liquid and Webby templates. So how can I start working with that? So do you build by yourself the Bootstrap, the CSS, or is there any source that we can grab something or?
Yeah, unfortunately, the one I'm working with isn't anything I deployed. I'm using the baseline that comes with a portal, which is still version 3. So that's the one caveat here. If you try to do version 4, it probably will shout at you. And I would just look up, there's bootstrap.org, or just look up the standard Bootstrap site. And you have to play with it a little bit because, again, the version that they're using is a bit old. I don't know. I think the product team's been asked about 400 times when they're going to update it. And I think there's going to be a significant code change to make that work. You can try to put in version 4 yourself, but what I'm using and where I've learned is I just went to the Bootstrap documentation for the standard Bootstrap version 3 documentation and leverage that. Everything else I might tweak and override some of the styles, but for the most part, like this is a Bootstrap modal, just as an example, and that worked fine out of the box. Here are some Bootstrap styles for pills, I think is what they're called, and buttons and whatnot. So most of it works fine, but it's still a bit older. So just when you go look at it, go check out the standard Bootstrap documentation, but make sure you're looking at version 3.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, Jim, I'm just gonna share my screen real quick.
Yeah, go for it.
Show a website that I usually use for branding content. If Teams allow me to share my screen. Come on, Teams.
Just ask nicely.
Yeah, I guess so. Okay, the share button is just gone. Okay, all right, got it now. Can everybody see my screen? So there's this site, bootswatch.com /3 that has a lot of templates, and this is pretty out of the box, if you will. It won't interfere a whole lot with the Microsoft template, but you can use that, so you can check the preview, see the markup for each particular component. So that's one place I would look at to get started, I think. And then, of course, you have the blog sites for Franco Musso, Ulrich, that they have lots of cool tips on branding that really helps. But if you do Bootswatch, make sure that you use the /3. That ensures that you are playing with version 3 instead of the latest. Yeah. Before I send it back to Jim, I wanted to highlight a few things here too. You asked about getting started with Liquid development somewhat. I would advise you to go to Jim's 4-part series on Liquid. I think I have the broken link for part 1, sorry, but it's a 4-part Liquid template guide if you will, and there is a wealth of knowledge on the site. Of course, Microsoft's documentation, as Jim was pointing out, is really good, but this has real life examples as well. So I would start here on part one, then part two, three, and four. I do have some content on Liquid myself, but it's more from stuff that I suffered, uh, not necessarily a huge guideline. So, I mean, this one is just typecasting in Liquid.
Yes.
What happens? There is one on entity objects, and this one was the issue I had was I was reading a value from the annotation entity, casting it to a variable, or assigning it to a variable rather, and then trying to read it. And the particular value was so large that the variable could not contain. Right. So it talks about it a little bit here that if you read it from the entity object, giving the attribute and the you are able to read the full value. But if you assign it to a variable, you may lose some of the contents of the field. So if you're getting started, I would most definitely say go to the Microsoft documentation as well as Jim's, because it's academic stuff, and this version is more layman suffering, basically. But it's good content either way.
Yeah, mine started with Microsoft's documentation is beefed up 100-fold. They've done a really good job over the last, God, like 2 years, really revamping their documentation across the board. They shut down a couple of sites, that kind of stuff. So they've done a really nice job. But it started with I started looking for just like standard tags and filters, and they weren't available because Microsoft's focusing on their extensions to the Liquid templating language. The thing to remember about Liquid is it's not specific to Microsoft, and in fact, they use a ported version. Started out with what, Shopify and Ruby, and Microsoft or somebody ported it to a platform called .liquid, and it's used in a whole bunch of different places. For example, I'm on a project right now where these Liquid templates are transformed JSON within healthcare data, and Microsoft has it's called the API for FHIR, FHIR. I'm like, oh, Liquid, I know that. It's like, of course, they have their own extensions to it, and it's really neat. They have their own tags. So the baseline language, I was looking for some of the common fundamental stuff, like you mentioned, the date time or variable data types.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of stuff is over on Shopify. Microsoft focuses on their extensions. So it's all good. And again, 100% better than what it was. That's where I started that series from, is like, here's the stuff I know I need, and here's the stuff that I'm running into. And again, the other stuff that you mentioned, I think would be really cool is looking at some of the little syntax quirks for like getting the linked entities back. What is the syntax for getting a linked entity back, getting an alias back? Little quirks like that, I think would be really nice to document. I have like 3 blog posts in draft form for the last nearly year, but so it's they kind of dried up a little bit. So hopefully I'll get a chance to get back to them. But yeah, that's some really good document. I like the Bootstrap one too. That one's awesome, especially if you just want to see it in action.
Yeah, I do use that a lot for POCs. I mean, quick turnaround, gotta get something up and running in days. Yeah. So that's where I go for. But then now I look at my templates, and then I browse through Franco's and Urick's templates, and I'm like, oh man, I gotta learn a lot of stuff. Yeah, I'm grateful for what they put out there. I mean, it does help a lot. So, anyways, let me see if there is anybody else. I don't think we have any additional questions. What I want to say before we go is it may maybe the session today felt like it was a rush of information coming at you. Maybe liquid, literally, a liquid hose, like a fireman session. Intense dump of information to you. But we're gonna have Jim again next week. And depending on how it goes, and depending on Jim's time, maybe we could rearrange and do a third session. If there is a need for it. So if you have questions, again, Jim has already placed his contact info up. You can ask him. You can ask us here on the chat window. There is a Teams channel that you can pose questions to. There are lots of folks here who have already been exposed to portals. They may be able to help. And the idea is that we interact. There is no final say in who has the official or the best information. It's just a place for us to share knowledge and help each other. But
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
don't feel overwhelmed. We'll get through this.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, this came from, I know it was a fire hose, but it came from the portal that I showed you. I've been working on for about 2.5 years now, and it was iterative, doing this and beating my head against a wall. So it's the same thing. Like your poster. Here's what I've learned from doing it. So there's no one right way of doing it. That's just my way of doing it. The batch and group by is an example of, man, I spent a lot of time doing that brute force, but I found this one thing that really helped me. So absolutely, feedback on this is absolutely welcome. I put up a list of links here for further reading, and I'm happy to share the slides if you want them. And here's a Victor's site is in here as well. Here are some places to go for some, really good stuff on portals in general, let alone Liquid.
Yeah, for me the session was really fluid, Jim. Really
Nice.
appreciate it. But I'm suspect. Right? I am suspect because I already like the stuff you post. But I think folks are pretty much saying, this is so elegant. That was amazing, James. So people are really excited about this content. Again, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for dedicating, taking your own personal time and resources for getting this ready for us. And we'll see you again next week. There are lots of hearts, man. You are loved in this place.
Stop.
All
Thank
right.
you very much. It's been great talking to everybody, and we'll talk next week.
All right. Take care, Jim. Bye bye.
All right, talk to
Bye,
you later.
everybody. Nice
Thank
talking.
you. Bye, everyone. See you next week.
Thank you so
thanks.
much.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
for sharing the links. So share is always on top of
Thanks.
the
Really nice.
Thank
Take care.
That's my late birthday present.
Oh, okay. So much appreciated.
Have a good week,
Thanks.
Victor.
Bye.
Thanks and good job. Very good. Thank you.